What is a constraint? What do we mean by constraints? Generally in English.
Restrictions?
Yeah, these are restrictions, right? So constraints are restrictions placed on columns, right? Each column can have a different constraint. So when you define a table, when you create a table, we say that these are the columns that we are going to use, right? And then we also say these are the data types, right? So we say that we will put only integer into it. We will put only characters not exceeding 20 characters. We will put only integers, right? Again, characters not exceeding 20 characters. Although we don't call it a constraint, right? So this is actually a constraint, a rule or a restriction, right? Saying that you can put only this data type. But other than this, you can have what are known as domain constraints, right? So domain constraints on columns. So there are 4 types of domain constraints, right? So they are your unique constraint. You have not null constraint. Then you have default constraint. And you have something called a check constraint, right? So each constraint is placed on a specific column. So let's say I am placing a unique constraint on the student ID column. So what does that mean? If I place a unique constraint on a column, what it means is you cannot have duplicate values in that column, right? So I can enter the first record, 25 and MySQL. But if I try to put another record with the same student ID 1, this will not be allowed because I have created a unique unique constraint on that column. If I don't have a constraint, I can put any number of, records like this, right? So I think we have our students table. Is there any records inside it? Select star from students. There are no records. We don't have any constraint at the moment, right? So I can put duplicate values. I can say insert into students values 1 Tom, then a course, right? So course is MySQL and marks is, let's say, 45, right? Second record also, I can have the same student ID. I can have student ID 1, John, right? MySQL and marks, right? So where did I make a mistake?
Comma.
Right. Comma. Okay. So if I say select star from students, it is allowing me to put a duplicate value into it. But if I impose a unique constraint on this, then it will not allow me to have the same student ID, right? So that is what your unique constraint is all about. Whenever you impose a unique constraint on any column, it will not allow you to have duplicates inside it. Similarly, if you impose a not null constraint, right? So let's say on student name, I am imposing a not null constraint. So that means it will not allow you to put null value into this. So not null means you have to specify a name, right? You cannot leave it as null. Nulls are not allowed into this column. That is what your not null constraint is all about, right? Check constraint will allow you to check for certain values before entering it. For example, I can say only if age is greater than 18, you can join, right? So if you try to put a record inside this, which is less than 18, this will not allow you to do that. That is your check constraint, right? So before entering a record, Any constraint that you specify here will be verified. Only if this is satisfied, you will be allowed to put a value inside it. Right? We will come back to default constraint a little later. Right? So let's look at these constraints. So I'll drop the table student. We will recreate it by imposing unique constraint on student ID. Right? So not null constraint on student name and check constraint on age. Right? So how do we do that? We can say drop table students. Now I will create table students, right? Student ID integer, but now I will also say unique, right? It doesn't have to be capitals. I'm just writing it because I want to highlight it. So student ID integer, it's unique. A unique constraint has been imposed. Then student name, let's say varchar of 50. And here we want to impose a not null constraint, right? Then we have age integer, right? And we'll say check age greater than 18, right? So only if it is greater than 18, you can enter a value here. Course column, we will not have any constraints. We will just make it varchar of 25 or something, right? Close this, semicolon, enter. Right, so now if you describe students, you can see student ID has a unique constraint on it. Student name, null is no, right? So this cannot be null. Check won't show up here, right? But we have a check constraint here. So let's see whether it is allowing us to put duplicates or not, right? So first let us insert a record. So we'll say insert into students values 1 Tom 23 and MySQL, right? So this is all proper. So this will be now what did I do? Comma again. Right. So now if you select star from students, the first record has been inserted. Now let us try to put a duplicate value into it, right? So let's try to enter another record with the same student ID, right? So I'll just change the name from Tom to John. Everything else I will keep the same. Now, if I enter this, what do I get? It says duplicate entry for key student ID, right? Remember, we are giving duplicate values for mark. We are giving duplicate value for course, right? But it is only complaining about student ID. The reason is we have imposed a unique constraint on the student ID column, right? So that is why it is not allowing to give the same value here. If you change it to 2, right? So everything else will go through. So let's say change this to 2, right? So now it allows me to put the value. Oh, yeah. So now it is allowing me to put the student ID. See, although this is duplicate, it is not complaining. This is duplicate, it doesn't complain, right? Only when this was duplicated, it was complaining because we had a unique constraint on this. Okay. Now let us try the check constraint, right? So I will try to insert a record where the student, I'll call this 3, Student name is Jenny. And she is only 13 years old, right? But she wants to learn MySQL. So now if you enter this, you say the check constraint is violated. What was the check constraint? We had given a constraint that age should be greater than 18, right? So only then you can allow. So anything less than 18, it is not allowed. Okay. So if you change this from 18 to, 13 to 19, it will allow you to put the record. Fine. Right. So this is your check constraint. Are you fine with the unique and check constraint?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So if you want, you can have multiple constraints on the same column, right? So you can make it unique and not null. Only thing is you just have to give it side by side, right? So when you say create table students, you will say student ID integer. You want this to be unique and not null also, right? No commas anywhere in between, just specify the both the constraints next to each other, right? So comma and so on. Okay, so this is multiple constraints can be given on the same column, right? So we have seen unique constraint, we have seen check constraint. Let's look at null constraint, right? So not null constraint. So not null constraint tells us that we cannot put null values into a column, right? So let's try to put a null value into a column. But then do you remember the two ways of putting null into a table? How can I put null into student name? Are there two values, two ways? Insert into students, values. I can say 4. Name, I can say null. Age is 25. Course is data science. Right, so this will try to put a null into the student name column. What is the other way to put a null?
Provide the column names.
Yeah, we provide the column names, right? So we will say insert into students and say we will give values only for student ID, age and course. Now you will say values, give values for this, right? So 5, 25 and data science. What is the difference between these two? Here we are putting null. We are explicitly putting null into it. Putting null value into the student name column. Here we are not doing it, right? So the MySQL is entering null for the student name column, right? Here we are explicitly saying put null into this. Here we have just omitted this. So MySQL will take the responsibility of putting null into the column, right? So let's try both ways and see whether it is failing or not, because we have made student name to be not null, right? So both of this should fail. So let's see what happens. So we'll say insert into students, values, 4, null, some 32 and data science, right? So now it says column student name cannot be null, right? As expected, we had given a not null constraint here. So now it says student name cannot be null, right? Let's try the second way. We will try to insert into students for student ID, age and course. Values, right? So student ID is 5, age is 43 and course is MySQL. right? So now what is it saying? It is not giving you the same error, right? So now it is saying field name sname doesn't have a default value. Although it is failing because of the not null constraint, here it properly says student name cannot be null, right? So here it says student name doesn't have a default value. So the reason is whenever MySQL is putting a value, right? So let me describe students. Whenever MySQL supplies value for missing columns, what it will do is it will see what is the default value that is specified, right? So what is the default that is specified for that particular column? What is the default value specified? For student name, the default value is null. So that is why MySQL is trying to put null for this student name column. Okay, it comes here and it sees what should be the default value that I have to supply. Here it is given as null. So it will try to put null for the student name column and it is failing, right? But what if we can change this? What if instead of null, I specify that the default value for student name should be Smith, for example? Now what will happen? Can you tell me what will happen in this case? When I execute this line of code, what will happen?
Default Smith will be accepted.
Yeah, 5 will be put into student ID, 25 will be put into age, DS will go into course, and it sees that there is no value given for student name. And in order to understand what value should be put into it, MySQL will go and check the default column, right? If you have specified Smith here, it will supply Smith. So now it will not get a not null, it will not get an error, right? Because we are not, or at least MySQL is not putting Smith null into it. So if I give a default value, this error will go off. How about this one? What will happen to this if I give a default value of Smith? So if I'm executing this value, right, here I will still get an error, even if I give a null value here. Why? Because here I have specifically said that I have to put null into it. Here I didn't say anything. Therefore, MySQL makes a decision based on what is there in the default column. But here it doesn't have to think, right? So we specifically said put null into it. It will say I cannot put null. Fine. Are you clear with the difference between these two?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So we will use the default constraint to give a default value here, right? So how do we do that? Either when we are creating the table, we should have mentioned it, or we will use the alter table command, right? So we'll say alter table students. We will use the modify clause, modify column, right? So student name, give it as if you are giving for the first time, right? So I have to specify varchar of 50. We had a not null constraint on it, but now I also say the default value should be Smith, right? So now if you describe your table, you can see the default value has changed from null to Smith, okay? Just a moment. Yeah, sorry. So now that we have replaced the default value, if I try to execute this, I will still get an error. But if I try to execute the second query, it should work, it should go through, right? So let's try that. I will give the first query. This will still give me an error. But if I try the second way, right? So now it goes through, right? So now if I say select star from students, you can see instead of putting null into it, MySQL has put Smith into it, right? Because we have specified a default here. Okay, so these are the 4 domain constraints or constraints that you can specifically impose on each column, right? The unique constraint will not allow you to put duplicates. Not null constraint will not allow you to put null values into the column. Check will allow you to specify certain conditions. Only if that is satisfied, your record will be inserted, right? And the default will allow you to change the default value in your for any column that you want. Fine. So these are the 4 domain constraints. Are we fine with this?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So tomorrow we will talk about referential integrity constraint, which is the heart of RDBMS. Right. So here we will talk about creating primary keys, foreign keys, and all. Right. We will touch upon the idea of normalization, although we will not go into detail, right? So let's first understand this primary key and foreign key, and then we can move on to other topics. Okay.